Welcome to the Southern Underworld. I'm Dakota, your guide through these twisted back roads of terror where Southern hospitality meets bone-deep dread. Whether you're here for blood-soaked deep dives or spine-tingling Southern Gothic tales, we've got your table ready. Fair warning, we don't pull punches down here. So settle in and remember, once you cross our threshold, there's no telling what's waiting in the dark. Tonight's descent begins now. The old man's fingers wrapped around his coffee mug like arthritic claws, steam rising between us in the diner's fluorescent glare. Coffee stains mapped the formica table like blood spatter, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd witnessed things that carved permanent shadows behind his pupils. "Don't go past Timber Creek," he wheezed through tobacco-stained teeth that clicked with each word. "That stretch of forest ain't meant for the living." The warning should have stopped me cold. Should have sent me running back to my dorm room to spend the weekend studying soil composition charts instead of hiking through the Cascade Mountains. But at 22, with a forestry degree within reach and 3 friends counting on me for adventure, I possessed that particular brand of arrogance that mistakes youth for invincibility. My name is Danny Ortega. 3 days ago, I was a senior at Oregon State University, planning a weekend camping trip with my buddies. Today, I'm something else entirely, something the doctors can't categorize or cure. They keep asking about the scratches on my arms, the way I flinch at sudden sounds, why I refuse to sleep without every light blazing in my hospital room. They don't understand that darkness brings the whistling, and the whistling brings them. The expedition started Friday morning, when 4 of us loaded Cameron Briggs' battered Jeep Wrangler with enough gear to survive a week in the wilderness. Cameron had appointed himself our leader through sheer force of personality, all swagger and stubble, claiming he'd mapped every trail in the Cascades during his summers working for the Forest Service. His confidence was infectious, the kind that made you believe you could conquer mountains or outrun avalanches. Natasha Boggs balanced Cameron's bravado with razor-sharp intellect and enough cynicism to cut glass. Pre-med with a double major in biology, she'd packed medical supplies that could stock a field hospital: trauma bandages, antibiotics, sutures, morphine injectors, and a portable defibrillator that she'd borrowed from the university's emergency response training program. Her laugh could strip paint, but her preparation kept us alive when things went wrong. Then there was Wesley Price. Quiet, bookish, with an encyclopedic knowledge of Pacific Northwest flora and fauna. He could identify any plant within 50 miles, but couldn't make eye contact to save his life. Where Cameron saw adventure, and Natasha saw potential disaster, Wesley saw an ecosystem waiting to be cataloged and understood. The diner crouched at the forest's edge like a warning made of weathered wood and rusted metal. The Timber Creek Cafe had probably served loggers and hunters for decades, judging by the mounted deer heads and faded photographs of men posing with enormous salmon. Inside, locals nursed coffee and watched us through calculating eyes, people who'd buried too many secrets beneath the mountain soil. That's where the old man cornered me while my friends argued over trail maps at the counter. "The whistling starts soft," he continued, ignoring my eye roll. His voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Like wind through branches. But it ain't wind, son. It's something that's been waiting out there longer than this town's been standing. Waiting for folks dumb enough to ignore good advice." Cameron slapped a 20 on the counter and flashed his trademark grin at the waitress, a weathered woman who'd probably seen every type of hiker from weekend warriors to extreme survivalists. "Thanks for the campfire story, Pops. We'll be sure to watch out for your boogeyman." The old man's face darkened like storm clouds gathering over the peaks. "Ain't no boogeyman. It's worse. Boogeyman takes you quick, clean. This thing." He paused, studying our faces with the intensity of someone delivering a final warning. "It wants you to know you're being hunted. wants you to understand what's happening while it happens. We laughed all the way to the trailhead, our voices echoing off the Jeep's roll cage as we bounced down the Forest Service road. Cameron cranked the radio, drowning out any lingering doubts with classic rock and the promise of adventure. None of us noticed how the music grew weaker as we drove deeper into the wilderness, or how the static increased until only fragments of songs reached us through the mountain interference. The forest swallowed us 3 miles past Timber Creek, where the maintained trail gave way to wilderness, and the tourist markers disappeared entirely. Ancient Douglas firs stretched toward a gray sky, their canopy so dense that noon felt like twilight. Our boots crunched through decades of fallen needles, layer upon layer of decomposing forest floor that muffled sound in ways that made my forestry training itch with wrongness. "Christ, it's quiet," Natasha muttered, adjusting her pack straps. The silence pressed against us like a physical weight, broken only by our labored breathing and the soft whisper of nylon against nylon as we moved. Wesley knelt beside a cluster of dead saplings, their bark peeling away in long strips that revealed pale wood underneath. "Soil composition's wrong here. pH levels are too acidic for this elevation. These trees shouldn't be dying in this climate zone." He pulled out his field notebook and began sketching the decay patterns with scientific precision. "Maybe they heard the whistling and gave up," Cameron joked, but his voice carried a forced edge that hadn't been there an hour earlier. We pushed deeper into the wilderness, following what might have been a game trail or might have been our imagination. The GPS on Cameron's phone lost signal within the first mile, and the compass needle began spinning lazily in its housing, unable to find magnetic north. Wesley's field guides proved useless. Every plant looked familiar but wrong, as if someone had taken the Pacific Northwest ecosystem and twisted it into something alien. We made camp in a clearing surrounded by towering sentinels of bark and shadow. The fire crackled to life as darkness pressed against our small circle of light, and that's when I first noticed the silence had weight to it, a presence that set my teeth on edge. No insects buzzed, no birds called from the canopy. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move through these trees. Cameron passed around his hip flask of Jameson whiskey. To ignoring local superstitions and having a damn good weekend. The metal felt cold against my lips, and the alcohol burned down my throat without providing its usual warmth. We drank. We talked about finals week, summer internships, and post-graduation plans. We tried to ignore how the darkness beyond our fire seemed to writhe with movement that vanished whenever we looked directly at it. Shadows shifted without wind to move them. Trees creaked without storms to bend them. Then Wesley's head snapped up like a hunting dog catching a scent. "Did you hear that?" We froze, every muscle tensing as adrenaline flooded our systems. In the distance, barely audible above the fire's pop and hiss, came a sound that raised every hair on my arms and sent ice water flooding through my veins. Soft and melodic, unmistakably human. Whistling. "Wind through the branches," Cameron said, but his knuckles showed white around the flask, and his eyes darted between the tree line and our diminishing pile of firewood. The melody drifted closer, a simple tune, almost childlike, but wrong in ways that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. It circled our camp like a predator testing defenses, always staying beyond the fire's reach but close enough that we could hear every perfect note. "That's not wind," Natasha whispered, her medical training kicking in as she checked our pulses and pupils for signs of altitude sickness or carbon monoxide poisoning. "Wind doesn't carry melody. Wind doesn't maintain perfect pitch." For 20 minutes, we sat rigid in our camp chairs, listening to that haunting melody weave through the trees. The tune repeated itself in perfect loops. 16 measures, always the same notes, always the same timing. Then it stopped, cut off mid-phrase as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, pregnant with a malevolent attention that made my forestry-trained senses scream warnings my rational mind couldn't process. "Probably another hiker," Cameron said, but nobody believed him. The sound had been too purposeful, too focused on our camp. Someone screwing with us, hazing the college kids. We took turns on watch, but sleep came in fractured pieces punctuated by dreams that felt more like memories. I dozed fitfully until Cameron shook me awake for the 3 a.m. shift, his face gaunt in the ember glow of our dying fire. "Anything happen?" I asked, feeding split pine logs into the flames until they roared back to life. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, a habit he'd quit months ago. The whistling came back around midnight, closer this time, and Danny. He led me to the edge of camp, his flashlight beam illuminating a darkness that seemed to absorb light. "I found these." Footprints circled our campsite in a perfect ring, bare human feet that pressed deep into the soft earth. The impressions looked fresh, made within the last few hours, but they formed a precise boundary around us that never crossed into the firelight's reach. "Could be old prints," I said, though the edges were sharp and the depressions still held their shape despite the mountain humidity. "Look at the stride length." Cameron knelt beside one print, his cigarette ember glowing like a firefly in the darkness. "Whatever made these stands at least 7 feet tall. And look here, see these scratches? Like claws scraped the ground with each step." The prints measured size 14 at minimum, elongated and wrong in ways that made my forestry training scream contradictions. Too narrow for human feet, with what looked like extra joints in the toes and claw marks that extended beyond where normal nails would reach. I spent my watch feeding the fire and fighting the urge to shine my flashlight into the trees. Every shadow could hide watching eyes. Every branch creak might mask approaching footsteps. The whistling never returned during my shift, but something worse replaced it. The absolute certainty that we weren't alone, that something circled our camp with the patience of a predator that knew its prey couldn't escape. Dawn brought no relief. Wesley discovered his hiking boots missing from outside his tent. Merrill Moab 3s that had cost him $200 and carried the distinctive wear patterns of his gait. Natasha's water purification tablets had vanished from her pack's side pocket, along with her emergency whistle and compass. Small things. Personal things. As if something had crept through our camp while we slept, sampling our belongings like a collector acquiring specimens. "We're leaving," Cameron announced, his earlier bravado replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd spent the night chain-smoking and staring into the darkness. "Pack up. Now, we hike out and never speak of this again." But when we reached the trail, we found our path blocked by fallen timber. 3 massive Douglas firs had toppled during the night, their trunks forming an impassable barrier across the narrow trail. Each tree was easily 6 feet in diameter and 200 feet long, giants that would have taken centuries to grow and industrial equipment to move. No storm had passed through during the night. No wind strong enough to topple giants like these had touched the surrounding forest. Yet there they lay, positioned with geometric precision to block our escape route. "We go around," Cameron decided, consulting his topographic map with hands that shook despite his effort to appear calm. That's when the whistling started again. It came from everywhere and nowhere, ahead of us on the block trail, behind us in the camp we'd abandoned, above us in the canopy where no human throat could reach. The same simple melody, but played by what sounded like dozens of voices in perfect harmony. A choir of the damned orchestrating our doom from the shadows. Wesley stumbled and caught himself against a tree trunk, his face pale as bone marrow. "It's inside my head. The tune, I can't get it out." It's playing on repeat like a broken record. We pushed deeper into unmarked forest, following game trails that seemed to shift direction when we weren't looking. The whistling followed like auditory quicksand, growing stronger and more confident with each mile. Sometimes it came from directly overhead, as if the source perched in branches 60 feet above the ground. Sometimes it seemed to emerge from the earth beneath our feet, vibrating through the soles of our boots. By evening, we were hopelessly lost. The forest had become a maze of identical trees and misleading paths that led in circles despite our careful attention to compass bearings and landmark navigation. We made camp in another clearing, building the fire higher and burning through our wood reserves with desperate intensity. That's when I first noticed the change in Wesley. He sat across from me, staring into the flames with glassy eyes that reflected orange light, but showed no awareness behind them. His lips moved silently, forming perfect O's and pursed positions. No sound emerged from his throat, but I could see him mouthing something with the rhythmic timing of music. "Wesley," I called. He blinked and looked up, confusion flickering across his features. "What?" "Sorry. Was I spacing out? The altitude might be affecting my concentration." "You were humming something." "No, I wasn't. I haven't made a sound in the last 10 minutes. But even as he spoke, his lips continued their silent dance, moving in perfect synchronization with the whistling that drifted from deeper in the forest. The melody matched his mouth movements note for note, as if something was using him as an instrument while he remained unaware of his own performance. Natasha saw it too. Her medical training kicked in as she pulled out a penlight to check his pupils and pulse. Dilated but responsive, pulse elevated but steady. "Wesley, do you feel nauseous? Any headache? Visual disturbances?" "I'm fine." But his lips kept moving, conducting that damned invisible orchestra with unconscious precision. Cameron grabbed Wesley's shoulders and shook him. "Knock it off, man. You're freaking us out." Wesley looked genuinely confused, his eyes focusing with effort. "Knock what off?" "I'm not doing anything wrong. I was warming my hands by the fire." The whistling grew louder, closer, and Wesley's mouth moved in perfect time with every note, while he seemed completely unaware of his own actions. His body remained still, but his facial muscles twitched and shifted as if controlled by invisible strings. "We need to snap him out of it," Natasha said, her voice carrying the clinical detachment she used when discussing cadavers in anatomy class. "He's in some kind of dissociative state." She slapped him hard across the face. The crack echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. Wesley's head snapped to the side, but his lips never stopped moving. The whistling continued without interruption, now seeming to come from the air itself, the trees, the ground, the space between atoms. It's not him whistling, I realized, the truth hitting me like cold water. Something else is using his mouth as a speaker. He's broadcasting for whatever's out there. Cameron backed away from Wesley, his face twisted with fear and disgust. "That's impossible. People don't work that way." "Look at him." I pointed at our friend, who sat rigid as a mannequin while his lips formed perfect musical phrases. "He's asleep with his eyes open. Something's puppet mastering him from a distance." Wesley's body had gone completely still except for his mouth, which continued its silent performance with the precision of a music box. His eyes had rolled back, showing only whites that gleamed in the firelight like polished marble. Drool leaked from the corner of his mouth and dripped onto his flannel shirt. The whistling reached a crescendo that made my skull throb and my vision blur at the edges. Every note felt like needles driven through my eardrums. Then it stopped with the abruptness of a severed cable. Wesley collapsed like cut strings, his body hitting the ground with the boneless impact of dead weight. For 30 seconds, he lay motionless, not even breathing. Then his chest hitched, his eyes fluttered open, and normal color returned to his face. What happened? Why is everyone staring at me? He sat up slowly, touching his cheek where Natasha had slapped him. Did I fall asleep? You don't remember? Natasha asked, checking his pulse and pupil responses with professional thoroughness. Remember what? I was sitting by the fire, and then you were all looking at me like I'd grown a second head. We told him everything. The silent lip movements, the synchronized whistling, the way his eyes had rolled back like a slot machine hitting jackpot. He laughed nervously and claimed we were letting the creepy forest get to our heads, but I saw the fear in his eyes, the recognition of something terrible he couldn't quite grasp, like trying to remember a nightmare that faded with morning light. Mass hysteria, he said, but his voice cracked on the words. Folie à plusieurs. It's a documented psychological phenomenon where groups of people share delusions. The rest of the night passed in shifts. 2 of us awake at all times, watching Wesley for signs of whatever had possessed him. The whistling came and went like a tide, controlled by lunar cycles we couldn't understand. Sometimes loud enough to shake leaves from branches, sometimes barely audible beneath the mountain wind. And Wesley's lips never stopped moving. Even when he claimed to sleep, even when his body lay still and his breathing deepened, his mouth continued its silent performance. The melody leaked from his unconscious mind like poison gas, calling to something in the darkness that answered with harmonies that made the trees themselves sway in rhythm. By dawn, exhaustion had worn us down to raw nerve endings and caffeine. Wesley looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes like bruises, though he insisted he'd slept better than he had in weeks. But I'd watched him all night, his body lying motionless in his sleeping bag, while his mouth conducted that damned invisible orchestra with metronomic precision. The trail, Cameron croaked through a throat raw from chain smoking. We find the main trail and get out of here. We hike out today, or we don't hike out at all. We broke camp with the desperation of soldiers under fire, stuffing gear into packs without regard for organization or weight distribution. The forest seemed different in daylight, less oppressive, but somehow more alien, as if we'd crossed into a parallel dimension where familiar rules no longer applied. The trees formed unnatural patterns. Douglas firs grew in perfect spirals around clearings that contained no stumps or signs of logging. Moss covered the north sides of trees in geometric designs that resembled circuit boards more than natural growth patterns. Then we saw it through the trees, the main trail cutting through the forest like a lifeline back to civilization. We ran toward it, crashing through underbrush and fallen logs, desperate to escape whatever had been playing with us for the past 36 hours. The Jeep sat exactly where we'd left it, coated in morning dew, but otherwise untouched. Cameron's hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the doors. The engine turned over on the 3rd try, and we pulled away from that cursed forest with wheels spinning on loose gravel and exhaust fumes hanging in the still air. Nobody spoke during the 2-hour drive back to campus. We were alive. We'd escaped. Whatever lived in those trees had released us from its web. Or so we thought. The familiar sight of the Timber Creek Cafe came into view like a mirage after crossing a desert. Cameron pulled into the lot, gravel crunching under the Jeep's tires. I need coffee. Real coffee made by human hands. And I want to see other people. Normal people who don't live in a Stephen King novel. The same old man sat in the corner booth, nursing what looked like the same cup of coffee we'd left him with 2 days earlier. His eyes found us through the window before we'd even climbed out of the Jeep. He shook his head slowly, like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis he'd seen too many times before. We ordered coffee and attempted to process what had happened to us. The warmth of the diner, the noise of normal conversation, the smell of bacon and coffee. It all felt like waking from a fever dream. We were back in the real world, surrounded by hunters and loggers and truck drivers who lived their lives without mysterious whistling or possessed friends. "We can't tell anyone about this," Cameron said, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug as if the ceramic could anchor him to reality. "They'll think we're crazy." Stress-induced psychosis from finals week. "We might be crazy," Natasha replied, falling back on her psychology training for explanations that made sense. Folie à plusieurs is a documented phenomenon, mass hallucination triggered by isolation and environmental stress. "Then explain the footprints," I said. "Explain the fallen trees blocking our path." "Hoax. Someone's been pranking campers for kicks. The trees could have been cut down during logging operations years ago." "And Wesley's whistling." They looked at him across the table. He sat staring into his coffee cup, both hands wrapped around the ceramic as if it were the only thing keeping him connected to sanity. His lips were pressed together in a tight line, completely silent for the first time in 36 hours. "I wasn't whistling," he insisted, but his voice carried no conviction. "I don't remember any of it. The whole thing feels like fragments of a dream I can't quite piece together." But as he spoke, I caught something that made my blood freeze in my veins and sent ice water flooding through my nervous system. The faintest sound, barely audible beneath his words, like a radio playing in another room. That same melody, soft and low, as if he were humming under his breath. I opened my mouth to point it out when Natasha started talking about her psychology classes, rattling off explanations and theories that could account for our shared terror. Her voice carried the rapid, nervous quality of someone trying to convince herself as much as her audience. The way people talk when they're afraid silence might let darker thoughts creep in. That's when I heard it again. The whistling. Not from Wesley this time, though his lips still moved almost imperceptibly. From Natasha. She talked about groupthink and shared delusions while that cursed melody leaked from between her words. Soft, almost inaudible, but definitely there. I looked at Cameron across the table. His face had gone white as printer paper, and his coffee cup rattled against the saucer from the tremor in his hands. He heard it too, the way Natasha's words carried that underlying melody, the way her breathing fell into the same rhythm we'd heard circling our camp. Natasha kept talking, oblivious to the sound emerging from her own throat like a carrier spreading disease, without knowing she was infected. The same simple tune that had stalked us through the forest, the melody of something ancient and hungry that collected souls like a philatelist collecting stamps. The old man in the corner booth caught my eye. His weathered face held no surprise, only grim confirmation of something he'd witnessed before. He'd seen this pattern play out with other hikers, other groups of young people who'd ignored his warnings and brought something back from the deep forest. The thing in the trees hadn't let us go. It had sent us home as carriers, spreading its influence beyond the wilderness that had contained it for generations. We were infected now, marked by something that turned human voices into instruments of its will. And as I sat there listening to Natasha whistle unconsciously, while she explained away our horror with clinical detachment, I felt my own lips begin to move. The melody rose in my throat like bile, sweet and toxic and impossible to stop. The curse had followed us back to the world of the living. Soon, everyone who heard us would carry it too. The waitress refilling our coffee, the truckers at the counter, the families driving past on Highway 20. And in the darkness of night, when sleep made them vulnerable, their mouths would move in silent symphony, conducting an orchestra of the damned that grew larger with every passing day. I tried to warn them. Tried to tell Cameron and Natasha what was happening to us, what we were becoming. But when I opened my mouth, only whistling emerged. that same haunting melody, perfect and terrible and utterly beyond my control. The old man stood up, dropped a $5 bill on his table, and walked toward the door with the slow gait of someone who'd carried too many secrets for too many years. As he passed our booth, he leaned down and whispered words that would haunt me for whatever remained of my life. "Told you so, son. Should have listened. Now it's too late for all of us." Then he was gone, leaving us alone with our coffee and our curse and the sound of 3 voices whistling in perfect harmony, while their owners remained blissfully unaware they'd become instruments of something that should have stayed buried in the deep forest forever. Outside, the sun shone bright and warm on the faces of normal people living normal lives. Birds sang in the trees that lined the highway. Traffic flowed in both directions, carrying families and workers and travelers who had no idea that something ancient and evil had found new vessels to carry its infection into the heart of civilization itself. And we sat there whistling, spreading the curse with every breath, while the darkness that had claimed us smiled from the shadows between the trees, satisfied that its web was finally expanding beyond the forest's edge. The waitress hummed while she cleaned our table. The cook whistled while he worked the grill. By sunset, half the diner staff would be carriers. By midnight, their families. Soon the whole town would be whistling. Then the cities, then the world. The old man was right. We should have listened. But now it was too late for listening. Too late for warnings. Too late for anything except the endless melody that would spread like wildfire through every human throat until the planet itself became one vast orchestra playing the song of something that had waited in the darkness for generations for its moment to conduct the symphony of human extinction. And in my hospital room, as I tell this story to doctors who think I'm suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, I can hear them beginning to hum. And that's where we'll leave you tonight, alone in the dark with nothing but shadows for company. If you're brave enough to come back for more, make sure you're subscribed to the Southern Underworld Playcast. We've got fresh horrors crawling up from the depths every Tuesday and Thursday at noon Eastern, because the best scares don't wait for midnight. If tonight's story left you sleeping with the lights on, a 5-star review helps other thrill seekers find their way to our little corner of hell. Every review drags more souls into our twisted family. Before you venture back into the night, our sincerest gratitude to the dark storytellers who craft these nightmares. All stories featured on the Southern Underworld Playcast are the copyrighted works of their respective authors and are shared with permission. You can discover more of their bone-chilling tales and support these masters of the macabre through the links in our show notes. So until next time, keep your doors locked, your lights burning, and remember, in the South, some things are better left undisturbed. Sweet dreams, if you can manage them. Copyright 2025 Dakota for Southern Underworld Press.